Thank you for joining us on the Going Deeper podcast, a ministry of Fathom Church in Littleton, Colorado. You will never get to the bottom of the depths that are in Christ for you. And our hope with this podcast is that it will help you go deeper with God. So let's dive into this episode of the Going Deeper podcast. What's up, everyone? This is your host, Kyle Knight, and welcome to the Going Deeper podcast, a podcast where we just hope these conversations help you go deeper in your relationship with God. I'm in the podcast studio with our very own missions and events minister, Karina Bost. Hello, Karina.
Hello.
And lead pastor, Chris Martin. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Kyle.
Hello.
Thanks for having me on this podcast.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I'm glad you can both be here for this episode. As you can see by the title of this episode, we're talking about leadership failures. Kind of a downer of a topic, but something that we just continue to see. You've maybe even had experience with this yourself, being in a church, someone you've looked up to, a pastor. But yeah, Chris, why do you feel like we need to talk about leadership failures on this podcast?
Yeah, so I think, it doesn't take too long for you to be a Christian and realize that that every leader is fallible, that you're going to run into, and gosh, it feels like every week, if not multiple times a week, if you follow kind of the Twitter sphere or the blogosphere or like Christianity Today or something like that, you're going to hear about a big name pastor, but either male or female, who has had some sort of moral failure or leadership corruption, and have been sat down from ministry. And this is actually only getting bigger and bigger as we think of things like the Hillsong documentary that was on Netflix, or is on, I think it's on Netflix.
I think it is. Yeah.
But it's, this is not just stuff that's happening even in the Christian sphere, but people are hearing about it outside of kind of the mainstream Christian sphere. So I think there are pastors and authors and leaders that I read and follow and have greatly benefited from, who are no longer in ministry, who have quote disqualified themselves from ministry, and so I think you've got that one spectrum of kind of the big name, well-known pastor or leader who fails and lets you down. What do you do with that? But then I think you can swing that all the way to a local pastor or a local leader who lets you down. Mm-hmm. Somebody that somebody that you're in relationship with who let you down. I think you can even swing that further to a regular Christian, a mentor, a friend, a small group leader, even just an older follower of Jesus who disappoints you by their behavior or by their response or by their actions. And so I think that, one of the things that I've said on repeat at Fathom since we started is at some point, I'm going to let you down. Mm-hmm. Now, hear me. I've already done that. I've let people down left and right, in big ways and in small ways. But I think the question I want to address is what do we do with that? Mm-hmm. How do we handle that as Christians? Why is this happening? Maybe we can do some diagnostic work, but also, what does that mean? What does it mean when a leader lets you down, fails, not just their ministry, but in a certain way fails you? And does that taint or corrupt everything that person did or said or wrote or preached? What do you do with those things? That's where I think I'd like to see the conversation go.
Yeah. And Karina, I'll just open up to you, just your first thought. We'll get into kind of what, some ideas of what to kind of do with this, if this happens to you. But Karina, just your first thoughts on sort of this whole big topic of leadership failures.
Yeah, I think it's something we see, and it's something I don't think until it happens, most Christians know what to do with it. And yeah, there's that level of trust that we feel like we put in leadership or mentors. And so when that's broken, you can feel more betrayed almost than in a lot of other relationships or contexts. So I think it's important to know ahead of time or to discuss and process. So that way when, because it will happen. So when it happens, you know how to
Mm.
respond.
Yeah. And Chris, I'm glad that you kind of brought up some distinction with, we're talking about leadership failures, not just lead pastor failures, those sort of things. And again, you could be listening to this and you could have examples in your day-to-day work life or something of that's not in a Christian sort of example. But Chris, one of the first questions I had with this, and it might sound kind of silly, but when we talk about, like, when we hear that term, like, moral failures, what are we talking about? Like, what are we talking about when, like, maybe just in leadership failures in general, what are we talking about? Because that, I feel like that could be super broad, but, like, what is a moral failure when it comes to, like, especially like a pastor or something? What are we dealing with?
Well, so I think we have to broaden the term a little bit, because I think immediately when somebody thinks, oh, a pastor has failed,
Mhm.
they think in three categories. Two of them are traditional categories. One of them is a modern category.
Mm.
The first is a sexual failure.
Mhm.
So-and-so had an affair with so-and-so, that kind of thing, or a pornography addiction or something like that. The second is a financial, transgression. So-and-so was skimming money off the top. They were taking, they were using church funds in ways they shouldn't, that kind of thing. The third one, which is a newer one, but it is overly common now, is a leadership failure when it comes to domineering and or bullying leadership. Those are kind of the three big buckets that I see as kind of the big ticket ministry leadership failures that you see, these moral failures. But I think we can broaden this to a moral failure is not living up to God's standard.
Mhm.
And not living up to God's standard is called sin.
Mhm.
So it's sinning. It's when you sin against someone or a group of people, when you fail to live a life of godly character that is in alignment with the capacity that you've been given for leadership in the church. So, I mean, moral failure could be gossip.
Mm.
You could be a pastor who is a gossip, who doesn't hold things in the right level of confidence. You could be a pastor who really is prideful and arrogant and just filled with, almost like an ego. Goodness gracious, like that's a moral failure. Now, certainly there are going to be gradients and levels within this of what is considered egregious moral failure, what is considered tolerable moral failure. And, oh, by the way, the question always when it comes to any sort of sin issue, whether it's a leader or a non-leader, is what is the state of one's repentance?
Mhm.
Is this an unrepentant sin, or
Mhm.
is this a repentant sin? And that can take some discernment and some process to figure those things out. But when we're talking moral failure, we're not just saying like, oh, they're not doing their job well. It's they're lazy. That's a sin. Being
Mhm.
slothful is a sin. They are being unkind, uncharitable. They are being untruthful. Those sorts of things. Those would be sins that would amount to moral failure.
I think that's good. Karina, do you have, and I mean, we don't need to be like name dropping any leaders that we have this experience with, but Karina, do you have um any kind of personal experience with sort of leadership failures or things that you have seen? And then we'll kind of get into what should our kind of reaction to this be.
Mhm. I mean, yeah, growing up in the church, I've seen church leadership, and yeah, it goes beyond just actually church, like Christian believers who have been mentors or whatever. I have grown up and seen them my whole life.
Mhm.
I've seen it in every different context. Um, and maybe it's because I was so closely connected to the church that I saw it more, maybe so than other places. But I think one thing that's important to remember is even though they're a leader, they're still human. But also on the flip side, like sin is still sin. Like
Yeah.
as Christians, we're called away from it, but we're still like leaders are still humans. Everyone in this room, we're leaders and still human. So
Right. Yeah, and I think the biblical piece to this that we don't want to overlook before we get into, and we should get into, like, why does this happen,
Mm.
and what are some ways to maybe protect against it, and
Mhm.
how do we respond to it, to somebody specifically. But leaders are called and held to a higher level, a
Mhm.
higher standard. I mean, biblically speaking, elders are
Mhm.
ministers, pastors, deacons. There's a level of there's a level of I don't know what even the right word is, but accountability might be the right
Mhm.
word. There's credibility that's on the line. You are essentially a representative of the gospel, and so you're putting that at risk.
Mhm.
It's not exactly the same as just a regular Christian dealing with a sin issue,
Above
right?
reproach.
Being above reproach, but then
Mhm.
also, especially those who teach, right? There is a, hey, it'd be better if, I mean,
Mhm.
there's warnings. It'd be better if
Mhm.
you get tied a millstone around your neck, kind of thing. So I do think that when we talk about leaders who sin, that's a big deal,
Mhm.
right? I think it's easy in a kind of a victim-based culture that everybody wants to be the victim. Even the leaders who fall, they can sometimes put on this
Right,
victim
right.
mentality of
Mhm.
like, hey, I didn't do it. It's my circumstances, or you don't
Mhm.
know how it is for me, or that, whatever it might be, that you try to use as an excuse for sin. No, leaders are held accountable at
Mhm.
a higher level.
Mhm.
And so I do think it's important to say, hey, sin. It's a sin issue.
Mhm.
Yeah, they're regular men and women, and it's still a big deal.
Mhm.
So we don't want to sweep it under the rug, nor
Mhm.
do we want to be over like hypercritical. I think
Mhm.
because I sometimes think we put leaders on pedestals
Mhm.
that they're never meant to be on, and that they are unable to bear the weight of.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah. So, um, why is this? And maybe it's just because it's highlighted more because of being in the church, but I feel like the majority of the leadership failures that I have seen or read about is in the church, is from pastors. Is that just because of this? We're supposed to be held to a higher standard. Is that because of the way today's society is, with everything being more under a microscope, with social media, all that other kind of stuff? Like, I feel like we do know there's other leadership failures all around, like no matter what kind of business you're in or anything, any other relationships you're in. But why is it feel like it's so, we always hear about pastors? We always hear about church leaders. And is that just because that's the majority of them, or it's because that's the one that's most talked about? I feel like every time I open social media or something, it's always, and you said it earlier, like somebody that you've kind of looked up to in the church for a really long time, and then all of a sudden you see that. So is it the microscope just more on churches nowadays, or is this everywhere?
Well, it's everywhere first,
Mm.
right? So, like, I mean, even when we want to rewind 20 years, Enron, right? Like, so there's
Mhm.
big business Ponzi schemes, sort of like, I was just reading the news today that uh, the gal who was in charge of something in Silicon Valley is going to prison for 12 years or what. I mean, like, so it does happen in the business world. The difference being, as Christian leaders, we have a moral framework that we are held to that's different than the rest of the marketplace. And two, it's very easy to see the hypocrisy that comes with that. So, for example, a CEO of maybe a company goes through a divorce. It does not
Mhm.
necessarily affect the bottom line for that company. In fact, in some cases, it's turned a profit. Okay,
Mhm.
uh, uh, if I go through a divorce, it will not bode well for my leadership in the
Mm.
church.
Mhm.
So that there's a, it's not like a double standard. It is a different standard. There is
Mhm.
a different
Right.
standard for the morals of Christian leadership than for a marketplace secular leadership position. But then I think you're right to point out the microscope that
Mhm.
exists today, which is actually one of the reasons that I think this seems to be. I don't know if I have no idea if it's on the uptick or not, or maybe we're just hearing about it
Mm.
more. But um, man, I get really nervous thinking about platform
Mm.
that's given to kind of the quote Christian celebrity.
Mhm.
Like, our church is not very big, my platform is not very big, and already I can feel the burden of what it is, like what it beckons, what it calls to, like the pride, the ego, the things that it can stir up in a leader. It's really dangerous. It's really dangerous stuff. And so, like Paul David Tripp wrote a book years ago called Dangerous Calling, where he talks about some of the inherent pitfalls of being called into pastoral ministry, into vocational church work. And it's really, I mean, it's a sad state of affairs, but if you look in the inner cover and all of the different people who kind of endorsed that book, almost all of them have been DQ'd from ministry. And I don't know, I can't remember when he wrote the book or who it was, but like you read the list and you're like, it's like I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy how many, there are very few who get a huge platform and are able to maintain integrity and character for the long haul. So, you know, to anybody in Christian leadership, but especially those who aspire to have a larger, quote, reach and, you know, national/international, quote, success, golly, we better be really careful. And we are some of the problem. Like I'm part of the problem because I'm the one who's reading their books and listening to their podcasts and, you know, getting like, we build the celebrity machine that takes a lot of these guys and gals down. But I do think the platform, the social media, like all of that only exacerbates the problem.
Right. So, and maybe we could talk about what are some things that we should do if somebody that we look up to, if we have a leader, someone who we trust, fails us. And I guess we'll keep it specifically to church leadership, but I mean, it can be leadership in general. But Karina, what are some ideas that you have about what if we're in that, what if people who are listening maybe came from a different church where that has happened, or like Chris mentioned, these guys and gals that we are, you know, reading their books, studying their things, and something like this happens. What are some things that you have for our listeners of like, what should we do in those kind of situations?
Yeah, I think one of the initial things that's important to do is pay attention to their response, which Chris kind of led to this already. Are they repentant or are they not? And that speaks a lot into like where they are and where they're going. I mean, you can just look, we've been in 1 Samuel, so this is just real fresh, right? David versus Saul, how they handled moral failures and their response to it. And I think that's a huge first step in like deciding, like, you know, is this still someone who's seeking God, or are they way out in left field doing who knows what? And I think how you see how they respond kind of gives you like a key to their heart health, or other indications or in other factors. So I think that's a great first step.
Yeah, I totally agree. In terms of watching how they respond, I think that's a big deal. The second thing I would also say is that one of the things we can do is we can, I'll just say, we can grow up. So let me just say this. Sometimes people will say, well, I don't know, like I walked away from my faith because this leader fell. I walked away from my faith because I had this church hurt, or, you know, whatever it might be. And I get that. And I want to be real sensitive to that. But why are you following Jesus? Like, I do think that's a valid question. And now hear me, psychologically, sociologically, we normally begin following Jesus not because of Jesus. We normally begin following Jesus because a leader tells us about Jesus or mentors us or shows an interest in us. And that is a good and right developmental cycle that begins early on when you first are exposed to the gospel. But we've got to mature. We've got to mature. So sometimes when people say, oh, you know, I haven't been back to church since that leader did this or that. And, you know, I just don't know if I can believe that. And I kind of want to push back and be like, so did Jesus rise from the dead or not? right? Like regardless of what that man or woman did or said or didn't do or didn't say, do you believe in the gospel? Like, do you believe in Jesus and his atoning work on the cross and his resurrection from the grave? Like, if you believe those things, like what are you here for? What are you about? And I think what happens is we stall out in a lot of ways in our growth. And I'm not saying leaders aren't important even as you mature into your faith. But what I'm saying is when you will begin to see men and women who are leaders and see them as they are, men and women. So I heard a quote, gosh, years ago, and I think it's a really helpful quote. This pastor I heard said, the best of men are only men at best. Like even the best of men are still only men at best. And this is why you read your Old Testament and your New Testament. And nearly every single major leader in the gospel narrative were deeply flawed individuals. Even David, the man after God's own heart, was not exempt from his own sin, his own failures, and was called out for it. And oh, by the way, was repentant.
Yeah. Well, even Moses, I mean, right? He,
the
man whose face shone the glory of God, right? Reflected the glory of God. And he still had sin issues, and that prevented him from entering the promised land.
Right.
So
not only his sin of killing the guy before he becomes Moses, called, but at the end of his life, the reason why he doesn't get to go to the promised land is because of his sin of anger, of rage, of not trusting the Lord. I mean, unfortunately, his story ends that way. So does David's, though, by the way. The end of David's life is a mess. I mean, we just, in the Bible reading plan, are just finishing 2 Samuel into 1 Kings. And it's like the end of his life is not great. It is not good for his children or for him towards the end of his life. It's really sad. But even the best of men are men at best. So I think when I say grow up, I mean that, hey, these are men and women. Human beings, not even if they're called to be shepherds of communities or of ministries, they are under shepherds of the great shepherd, Jesus Christ. And oh, by the way, they're also sheep. They are sheep to be tended by his rod and his staff. And so that's where the pedestal piece comes into play. Like, I think we've got a lot of immature Christians who think, well, if that guy falls, then all that I believe is in vain. And it's like, no, why do you believe that? Why do you believe the things that you believe?
Well, and I even have in my notes, I think we kind of might have talked a little bit about this or hinted at it when we did an episode a little bit ago about finding a church and leaving a church. And that kind of reminds me of, just excuses that we make to when I think of that, I think of COVID. COVID was kind of that excuse for people to be like, you know what? We're not going to church anymore. And it was like, well, were you really all in on this? Or did you just need a little bit of help, a little bit of an excuse to say like, oh, that's so when Chris, when you're talking about, a leadership failure, I think a lot of people do kind of take that as like that's the reason why, I'm not going to do this anymore. I have written down here something that we could do. It goes along with that. It's like, I said, don't let this rock your faith. And in Psalm 146, it talks about put not your trust in princes. So it's like, that's like, these are people, like, who are you? And I know that's a huge, and I think it's just even more amplified now with social media and in churches in general, that it's like, what church do you go to? Oh, I go to this pastor's church. I go to that pastor's church. And it becomes kind of like that. Who are you following? Are you following Jesus Christ of the Bible, or are you following that pastor? And if that person fails and falls because of sin, and we do, it's like, is that going to completely rock your faith? And you're going to say, okay, I'm done with this.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good point to make.
I know we're running out of time, but let me ask this final question, because I think we three are vocational church workers. We are leaders in our church. We're held to a higher standard. And so maybe to close out, why don't we say from our perspective to our church, friends and family who are listening, members of this church, how we feel like we could be supported in this. Like, what are ways that we can be encouraged and built up, and Fathom can be a safe place for us as well to be men and women at best. What are ways that we might say to our D groups, to our friends, to our members of our church? Any thoughts on that before we kind of shut this one down?
Yeah, I think one big thing that hit me was, and even now that I'm in leadership, it's even more relevant. Like, am I praying for leadership? It's like one of those things we think we should do, but it's often neglected. And we underestimate the power of prayer. And I think if your whole entire church body is diligently praying for you, that's a protection that you can't get elsewhere. It's not, I mean, that's like I always say, Oswald Chambers says, like, prayer is the greater work. It doesn't prepare us for the greater work. It is the greater work. And I just sense the value of prayer. And when people say that they're truly praying for me, that's always like, wow, that's amazing. Like, I just really feel that, if people are praying for me to grow deeper with Christ, to be humble enough to confess my sins, to constantly be renewed in my spiritual walk, like those kinds of things, there's power in that. And I think that really helps you stay grounded. And just helps the Holy Spirit to stir and work in you in ways that might not happen otherwise.
Right. What do you think, Kyle?
Yeah, that was top of my list, was pray. But also, I mean, to go along with that, I feel like I could always say, we would love encouragement. We would love for all of you to pray with us, but also to show us grace. I have a bunch of scripture on here that talks about being gentle. And I know gentle is such a weird thing nowadays. But like we are called to be, like Galatians 6:1, it says, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. And so, and to me, that's not necessarily saying, hey, when we screw up, just be like so kind to us and just forget about it, give us all that grace or whatever. But I think just this encouragement and showing gentleness, but also help restoring us, I think that kind of goes along with this whole like we need people to build us up. We need people to encourage us, even when things are going really well, because you don't know what somebody's dealing with, like behind the scenes, and leadership is hard. And so pray for us, yes, but yeah, come alongside us and encourage us and give us grace, but also just let us know that, like, hey, you're kind of on our side. You're here for us. You're here. I know us as leaders, we are always pouring into other people, which is, I mean, why we're in these positions. And someone like me, like I have a hard time asking for that or receiving that. So come alongside us and pour into us and give us that encouragement. I mean, that goes a really long way.
Yeah, I think those are good and right, both of those. And church, I know if this all sounds a little self-serving for us, but that's why we get microphones. We can do this. But I'll do one more and then we'll shut this one down. I think we should celebrate character over competence. And I think this is hard to do culturally, but I think we love to celebrate how good people are at the things that they're good at, like their competencies. Man, Kyle, you did a great job on leading that youth retreat. Really good. Oh man, Karina, that event or that missions trip. Great. I mean, just even the commissioning, that's so great. Like, good job. And we celebrate competencies and wins in that, and we work on lack of competencies and weaknesses and strategic reviews and things like that. And I think that's all good and right. But I would like for us to begin to think through how we celebrate character, how we celebrate fruit of the Spirit things, not necessarily gifts of the Spirit things. So how does that look? I don't know. I mean, I can't even begin to know. But like, people encouraging us on how we do our work is very helpful.
Mm.
But I think a lot of the moral failures that happen in leadership can happen because of an inflated sense of one's giftedness
Mhm.
and a loss of one's submission to the one who gives the gifts.
Mhm.
So I don't know how to do that. I'd love to continue to have those conversations about how do we create a culture where we're celebrating uh, not competencies, but character traits. That'd be a cool thing. So.
Mhm.
It would be a cool thing. Yeah, we're well out of time for this one, but thank you, church, for listening. And again, if you are, we know there is a lot of church hurt when you're coming from your past. Everyone's kind of got a past with church, really. And so if you're coming here and you've had problems with leadership or something like that has affected you, please come and talk to us. We'd love to chat with you about that and encourage you through that. But thank you guys for this discussion, and thank you, church, for listening, and we'll see you next time.